All right, welcome everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here this evening for this joint presentation between Village Preservation, the New York Preservation Archive, and Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. And we're going to be talking about Village Preservation's recent landmarking report. So our presentation this evening is Landmarking in New York City since 1965, the highs and the lows. So before I hand it over to our presenters, if you are unfamiliar with village preservation, I just want to tell you a little bit about us. We were founded back in 1980, and village preservation works to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped secure landmark designation of more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and host over 75 free programs like this throughout the year. And I know because I'm the director of programs at Village Preservation, and we put on great shows and programs for you. But we are also a member-based organization. So if you're interested in learning more about the work that we do, registering for one of our upcoming programs, we have a fabulous selections of programs plus this one through November. So please go ahead, take your phone, scan that QR code that you see on your screen right now, or pop over to villagepreservation.org and learn more about all the fantastic advocacy work that we do, amazing free resources that we have, and also consider giving a donation and becoming a member. We have a whole series of different memberships available. So please head over to our website and learn a little bit more about our events, membership, and the work that we do. Now for our partners this evening, Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. They were founded in 1982. They're an independent not-for-profit membership organization dedicated to preserving and celebrating the architectural legacy, livability, and sense of place in the Upper East Side through advocacy as well as educational programming. So very similar mission to us. And this evening, we are joined by Nuha Ansari, the Executive Director of Friends, and Zeynep Duran, the Manager of Preservation and Outreach. And there is their website, friends-ues.org. So please pop over to that website. And I'll be putting all of these links into the chat throughout the evening. So you'll be able to that. And all of these links will also be included in the follow-up email that we'll be sending tomorrow or the day after. And then from New York Preservation Archive Project, we're joined by Emily Kahn, their executive director. And New York Preservation Archive Project is dedicated to documenting, preserving, celebrating, and educating about the history of historic preservation in New York City. The project brings these stories to light through public programs, oral histories, and providing public access to information. Now, before I introduce our two presentees from Village Preservation, I just want to tell you a little bit about the structure of this evening's presentation. So we're going to have two presentations from Andrew Berman and Dina Tass-Winter, and I'll be introducing them in just a second. They'll be doing their presentations, and then they're going to be joined in conversation with Nuha, Zeynep, and Emily afterwards. And then after that conversation, we will have a Q&A portion. So if you have questions and it pops into your head and you are afraid of forgetting that question, please go ahead, take advantage of the chat or the Q&A feature, and then I'll be asking those questions on your behalf in the last portion of this evening's program. But now without further ado, let me introduce Andrew Berman. He is Village Preservation's director since 2002. He's a lifelong New Yorker who has studied architectural history and worked in the city and state government and has been known for his passionate advocacy around issues as diverse as tenants' rights to LGBTQ representation. And then Dina Tass-Winter is Village Preservation's Director of Research and Preservation and is a historic preservationist, writer, and she's a native New Yorker and Greenwich Village resident. She holds an MA in Historic Preservation and Cultural Heritage Management from the University of York in the UK, and a BA in music history from the University of Rochester. So Andra, Dina, I'm going to hand it over to you. I will be disappearing into the shadows, but I will be here if anybody needs me.
Uh, Great. Thank you so much, William. And you'll all be hearing from Andrew in just a few minutes, but I'm going to kind of do the introduction to our report and the data that we gathered to be able to do the analysis. So let me just share my screen for you all. All right. I think that should work. Great. Sorry, just a second. Okay, ready to get started. So once again, my name is Dina Tass-Winter, and as William said, I'm the Director of Research and Preservation here at Village Preservation. And I'm really pleased to be here to introduce this work and to be joined by the New York Preservation Archive Project and Friends of the Upper East Side. Just very briefly to tell you a tiny bit more about myself, sort of in the context of this work that I'm about to share with you. I've been Village Preservation's Director of Research and Preservation for about a year and a half now. And prior to that, for almost 5 years, I was a landmarks preservationist with the Landmarks Preservation Commission, or LPC, as you'll frequently hear it called this evening. And so with that background, my role there, along with a team of other colleagues, was to review every project about existing landmarks throughout all 5 boroughs of New York City, to review any scope of work that was proposed, whether it was restoration on a building or new construction in a historic district or things like that. But throughout the course of that work, my coworkers and I would spend a lot of time kind of in the depths of the designation reports, which are issued by LPC for every single landmarked building and historic district, with tons of information, background information about the style of the building, its age, the reasons that it was designated, and things like that. So I come into this project with kind of that understanding of what landmarking is in the city and the types of things that have been landmarked. But as you'll see in just a moment, while a lot of that information does exist out there, it was always kind of obfuscated in a way. Technically, it's out there, but it's really hard to, as a layperson or even as a professional preservationist, it was almost impossible to readily understand what was designated each year and getting a broad strokes view of what was designated when and the themes that might emerge from that since the landmarks law was enacted in 1965. So to start off, I wanted to share what was available and still is through the city. So this is the Discover New York City Landmarks map, which is a really great resource that shows you geographically where every single landmark designation in the city is. And here I've taken a screenshot zooming in on Lower Manhattan because that's Village Preservation's purview and where I spend most of my time these days. But you can see it for all 5 boroughs on their website. And here you can see the shaded yellow areas. Oh, sorry. The shaded yellow areas are historic districts. The pink dots are individual landmarks, and the purple dots are interior landmarks. There's also a 4th type of landmark in our city called scenic landmarks. And I just wanted to give a brief explanation of what each of those 4 things, those 4 types of designations are to start off, so that many of you on this call might already know, but just so that everybody's on the same page, because you'll be hearing a lot, especially once Andrew gets into some more of the analysis and trends that we discovered over the years of these different types of designations. So our city has nearly 40,000 buildings and sites that have been designated, and they fall into different categories. So our historic districts, we have 157 of them, and just to go back for a second quickly, as I mentioned, it's these yellow shaded areas. You can see in this part of Manhattan what kind of proportion of the city is within a historic district versus outside of one. And the way I took this photo, you can see a little edge of Brooklyn here that has a historic district, but there are many more if you zoom out and look at the map in a broader view. But of those historic districts, the first one was designated in 1965, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what was designated when in a moment. So keep that in mind, but we'll get more into that shortly. There are also, and within the historic districts, there can be any number of buildings that were designated. So our smallest historic district has just 2 buildings within it, whereas some of our largest districts have multiple thousands of buildings, and that'll come into play once you get to see the full data in a moment as well. There are also individual landmarks, and these are by far the greatest number of landmarks we have in New York City. And those can be anything from, the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building, these kind of monumental landmarks that you would think of. But they can also be a small stable building somewhere in Brooklyn that was deemed worthy of designation for its historic significance and architectural significance. The example here, the Astor Library, was among the first to ever be designated, and you might know it today as the Public Theater. The other 2 types, as I mentioned, are interior landmarks. There are 123 of these, and the majority of them are also buildings that are designated as individual landmarks, but their interiors were also specifically designated. And in the city of New York, these have to be buildings that are publicly accessible. So the most common types you would see might be Broadway theaters, museum lobbies such as this, public libraries, bank interiors, things like that. And then we have just 12 scenic landmarks. And this example here is Central Park. And I'm going to kind of show you when these things started to proliferate as the landmarks law was underway. So going back to the information that was available to us at the start of this project, the main place where I and 2 of my colleagues at Village Preservation, Chloe Gregoire and Emily Gioberti, the 3 of us were kind of the data team, and we prepared all of the data that Andrew then ran with and did all of this really interesting analysis with. So we sourced all of that data from this place called NYC Open Data. It's actually a really interesting resource, not only for landmark buildings, but really for anything that you can quantify in the city. You can find like every single lamp post that was ever built or installed, or zoning actions that have happened, or FDNY actions, or all different kinds of things. But in this case, we were looking for our landmark data. So this is just this view here is just a really brief snapshot of what we were faced with when we pulled the data. So you can see the caption here is designated and calendared buildings and sites. So that encompasses every single building and site that either has already been designated as a landmark or has been calendared, which means that it's currently under consideration by the Landmarks Preservation Commission for designation. And if you can see this smaller print on the bottom here, there are 38,786 individual rows of data. And as I mentioned, there's nearly 40,000 buildings and sites that have been designated in the city. So that correlates. But it's really kind of a mess when you go into this version of the data. Unless you know exactly what you're looking for, the precise address, you can use the search function to search for it. But if you wanted to say what historic districts were designated in 1972, it would take minutes, if not hours, to sort through all of this and find what you're looking for. So in order to do the analysis that we wanted to do, we needed to first take all of these thousands of cells of information and turn it into something readable and easily accessible. So this is what it turned into. This is all LPC designations through June 30th, 2024. We used that kind of clean half-year mark as the endpoint for now, though Village Preservation will be continually updating this and keeping it up to date on our website, so you can always use it into the future as well. But here, I just wanted to kind of show you how this is all laid out. So you can see these are the most recent years, and you can see how many designations were implemented each year. So on average, in the past few years, it was anywhere from 5 to 10 or so designations, which is kind of a specific point related to some of what Andrew will talk about later. But keep in mind the number of designations that we have received in recent years in the city. And then you can see the number of buildings all the way on the other side, on the right-hand column. So you can see that we kind of collated and organized every historic district and determined exactly how many buildings were designated within the districts. So that's why when you look at the grand total of number of buildings designated, it almost never lines up with the number of actual designations, because the designations is, one historic district gets one designation, but it may have hundreds of buildings within it. So that's one thing that you can easily see when looking at this spreadsheet. Another thing I did to try to make it kind of easy to parse is that anytime something is designated not an individual landmark, but any of the other categories, historic district, interior landmark, or scenic landmark, I bolded it so that you could quickly get a sense of what was designated, what types of things were being designated in any given year. So you can see, for example, through June of the current year, there's quite a variety. There's a couple of interior landmarks, one historic district, one scenic, and a few individuals. Versus 2023, they almost exclusively designated individual landmarks, and there was one historic district. And you can go through all the way back to 1965 to see how those trends shifted over time. So before I turn it over to Andrew, I just want to show a few examples of the initial trends and themes that we started to see as we looked through this organized data. So now I've scrolled all the way back to 1965, which is the year that the Landmarks Preservation Commission was created, and the first year that any buildings or landmarks were designated in New York City. So back then, they actually only had individual landmarks and historic districts. And as you can see, the vast majority were individual landmarks. They were kind of raring to go when LPC was created. They had all these buildings, such as the Astor Library that I mentioned earlier, that they knew they wanted to designate, and they were ready to jump in and do that. And then the very first historic district designation kind of eked in before the end of the year. So December 21st, 1965, the Brooklyn Heights Historic District was our very first historic district in New York City. And then in 1966, they designated a lot of individual landmarks and also 4 historic districts. And the first one within Village Preservation's current area of purview, which is the Charlton King Van Dam Historic District, designated in 1966. The Greenwich Village Historic District was designated in 1969. And alas, I forgot to look up when the Upper East Side Historic District was designated, but I'm sure Nuha can let us know later, or you can look it up on our spreadsheet at your leisure. A few more things I wanted to quickly tell you about. So as I mentioned at first, it was only individual landmarks and historic districts. The first time LPC decided to designate both interior and scenic landmarks was in 1974, so almost a decade after LPC came into existence. The first scenic landmark was Central Park, and the first interior landmark was the main branch of the New York Public Library's lobby. These ones highlighted in red here are not the very first, but they were designated in that same initial year. So you can see they kind of relatively quickly started to consider designating a number of interior and scenic landmarks that they thought were worthy of designation. So then a few different themes started to pop out at me as I was looking at all of this data. One is geographic themes. So you kind of get the sense as you start to review all of this that LPC perhaps had kind of certain geographic areas that they tended to focus on in certain years. Maybe they received a request for evaluation for a certain neighborhood, or maybe just their own research team was going on site visits to certain neighborhoods and really honing in on certain areas. So this is just one example on the Upper East Side in 1980 when they designated a whole slew of buildings on East 73rd Street all at once. And I found this interesting also because if you look at the map, you'll see that all of these buildings that I've boxed in red here they're kind of two rows of buildings across the street from each other. And they could have been designated as a historic district because it's this kind of contiguous area of buildings. But for whatever reason, LPC chose to individually landmark the buildings, which, in terms of them being landmarks, they are landmarks either way. And every building in a historic district does have landmark status, but just in terms of parsing the data and thinking about when the city creates historic districts or not, I thought it was interesting to see when they choose to do it one way or the other way. And then one kind of fun tidbit is that it's not only buildings or parks and landscapes that are designated. And as you look through and kind of search for themes throughout the years, you can also see thematically that LPC was designating other types of things. So in 1981, they designated a whole slew of sidewalk clocks all within that year. In the late 1980s, they shifted to an emphasis briefly on things like the parachute jump on Coney Island and also the cyclone over there. And actually the Coney Island boardwalk itself was designated, but not until a number of years later. And then there are two trees that are landmarks in our city. Sorry, this is a little blurry, but just briefly, I kind of did it on purpose to show you how in 1987, there was a really vast quantity of Broadway theaters designated. So this is another kind of example of, you can see themes coming through, and in certain years, certain things happened. And it's also an example of how we needed to think about the data. So this looks like, tons and tons of buildings were designated, but as you can see, almost half of them were interior landmarks. In that particular year, they designated a lot of theaters, and then also those theaters' interiors. And so it looks like a lot, but it's only 37 buildings. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on before I turn it over to Andrew is the idea of cultural themes. So in more recent years, we've seen that LPC is starting to think about not only architectural history, but cultural history, which is great and so important in our city. And so one example of this is this push to designate buildings that were significant for their LGBTQ plus heritage in 2019. Here are some examples. And actually this somewhat came out of Village Preservation's push to get the Stonewall Inn designated, which we did achieve a few years earlier in 2015. But then, by 2019, for some reason, LPC was ready to designate a whole slew of these buildings, which they did. And I think, there's a recent equity framework where LPC is supposedly thinking about different cultural themes and things like that. And that might come into play a little bit in what Andrew is going to talk about. So I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Andrew Berman. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dina, and thanks so much for that fascinating presentation. I'm now going to share my screen, and I'm going to assume everybody can see this unless I hear otherwise. Whoops. There we go. Yeah, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the analysis that we then did with the information that came out of all of this wonderful data that Dina and the team put together. And it's this report, Analyzing New York City Landmark Designations, with a particular focus on a review of mayoral influence and policy. So meaning, what did we see changed from mayor to mayor? What did we see change when either different policies or different laws that impacted landmark designations changed. And William, I'll just ask you to put a link in the chat to the report now. And I'm going to try to advance my screen. And this, by the way, is one of many reports that Village Preservation produces and has produced. Here's a just showing you some of our other recent reports. So William will also drop in the chat the link to our page with all of our various reports, which look at things like landmark designations, zoning, etc. So one might ask, why did we do this report? And the reason why is I felt as though it felt like there had been a dramatic drop off in landmark designations with fewer and smaller historic districts in recent years, especially, and more designations of sites that weren't endangered and where designation would have a limited impact upon preservation. Now, I've been working in the landmark designation field to some degree for 30 plus years, and I've been interested in it for 40 plus years. So I've observed what's gone on, but I didn't have an empirical data to really look at to compare, as Dina discussed. There was really no place to look at and say, well, here are the numbers. There is more, there is less. Well, it may feel that way, but it's really not. So I thought it was critical that we put together the information to be able to look at that. And as somebody who's worked in government, it was very clear to me that it was important to slice and dice this by mayor, because as with any city agency, nobody has more influence over what they do, including the Landmarks Preservation Commission, than the mayor, who not only gets to pick who becomes chair, as well as who becomes commissioners. But, you know, in the reality of the world in which we live, they give those appointees a great deal of direction, parameters to operate within, et cetera. And ultimately, they are responsible for what any city agency does. So just quickly, a couple of definitions, which, Dina hit on before, in terms of trying to figure out, okay, so what happened over the course of the years in terms of more, less, different, et cetera. There's a few different ways of looking at it. One, and this is all directly from the report, is just landmark designations. So as Dina said, that's anything from an individual designation to an interior or scenic designation, or a district, which can be anything from 2 to the largest single district is 2,300 buildings. There's also, we count with district extensions, which can also be very, very large. Some of them are several hundred buildings. As Dina mentioned, an individual designation can be a tree, it can be a clock, it can be a bridge, it can be a statue. In most cases, it's a building, but not always. So we looked at designations, we looked at districts, since by far the majority of designations in New York City, or of buildings that are designated because they fall within a district, and then the total number of buildings designated as a way of slicing and dicing it. And here's what we came up with. There's a sort of an old saying about, well, I hope I'll be proven wrong. Unfortunately, in this case, I was not. Looking at these numbers, which we're going to drill down on a little bit more, and the sort of deeper brown, as you can see, is the number of buildings designated per year. The sort of teal color is the number of historic district designations per year, and the orange is the number of landmark designations per year. As you can see, under the Adams administration, it is the low performer of all of the mayoral administrations since the landmarks law has been enacted. There was an initial burst under the first 2 mayors, which is completely understandable. And in fact, Wagner's office, term in office, only overlapped by 6 months. So this is actually sort of prorated. Lindsay was there for those kind of first years. And then, so those were the sort of 2 high performers. In the years following that, Dinkins, Bloomberg, and de Blasio sort of came in the middle. And then the bottom tier, as well as Koch. And then the bottom tier clearly was Giuliani, Beam, and Adams, although even within that bottom tier, Adams is kind of an outlier, and we're going to look a little bit more closely at that. So this is breaking out some of that data. So this is just number of landmark designations per year, showing the average during all mayoral administrations prior to Eric Adams and Eric Adams. As you can see, initial burst, most of the mayors after that averaged somewhere in that sort of 30 range. Then there was a drop of almost half under de Blasio, and then a further significant drop under Adams. Now looking at historic districts, this might look like, oh, ups, downs. It's, really just kind of changes from time to time. This is the only area in which Adams is not the lowest performer. He averages 2 historic districts per year on an annualized basis. Beam came in just under him. But what's important to really look at with this is, what are those districts and how big are they? So if you actually look at the size of the districts, even compared to Beam, Adams' historic districts are tiny by comparison. The average of all mayors prior to Adams was 234. As you can see, some of them average particularly large ones. Wagner, in his 6 months in office, just did one, that rather large initial Brooklyn Heights historic district. After that, most, the mayors in the sort of upper tier tended around the 300s, the sort of middle tier around the 200s, and then you have Adams, Beam, and Giuliani at about 100 and below. And so Adams, the districts he designated were the smallest of them all. So combine that with the fact that he designated, for the most part, the fewest. And this chart here also kind of gives you a sense of what that looks like. This is not just the average of each mayor's historic district designation sizes, but the biggest ones and the smallest ones. And so as you can see, districts designated under Mayor Adams were particularly modest, would be a nice way of putting it, compared to his predecessors. Again, his closest peer is a Beam, but the districts designated under Beam tended to be at least about 50% larger. And so just as a comparison, as mentioned before, among the sort of large historic districts that we see in the first 50 or 55 years of the Landmarks Preservation Commission are ones like Brooklyn Heights, which had about 1,400, Greenwich Village here, which had about 2,300. In the late 80s or early 90s, Jackson Heights, which had several hundred buildings. This one here is Central Ridgewood in Queens, also I think somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 buildings. Here in Brooklyn, we have Clinton Hill and Fort Greene, designated in the 1970s, I believe. More recently, I believe it's either in the late 90s or early 2000s, we have the Grand Concourse Historic District. So these rather extensive districts. Then we get to the Adams administration, and what we typically see in almost every case are these very, very small districts that cover a block or part of a block, and have relatively few buildings. So this is the Cambria Heights 227th Street Historic District, and this is Melrose Parkside. Beautiful buildings, beautiful districts, tiny. So definitely a very, very, very different scope as compared to what had been done under prior mayors. So here, looking at what I think in a lot of ways is sort of the most important and telling metric in terms of designation activity under a mayor, and that is the number of buildings designated per year. You can see Adams clearly is at the bottom of the heap by far. Wagner, again, prorated, he was only in there for 6 months, is the high performer along with Lindsay. You then have Dinkins, Bloomberg, and de Blasio, and sort of the next tier beneath that, followed by Koch. A significant drop-off with Giuliani, a further significant drop-off before that with Beam, but Adams beating them all when it comes to low numbers. And this is based on an annualized rate. So it's irrespective of how long a mayor for all of these figures was in office. This is the rate of their designations per year in office. So then we also wanted to look at breaking this out by geography to see whether or not these changes that we were seeing, particularly from Mayor Adams, were about or reflected a shift in emphasis, and if some parts of the city were perhaps seeing more attention while others were seeing less. And so it's less about a decrease in raw numbers and more about just a kind of a shift in emphasis. And this is a very complicated map. And by the way, if you are interested in all of this, please spend some time, look at the report. But the piece over on the far right-hand side is the most important part. This is broken out by outer boroughs, Upper Manhattan, and Manhattan core, which is a terminology, I'm just going to go back to that the city uses, which is basically Manhattan Community Boards 9 through 12. So that's south of 110th Street on the west side, south of 96th Street on the east side. So that's a geography that the city looks at as an important distinction. Upper Manhattan and the outer boroughs, I think, is pretty clear. So you can see on the right-hand side, this is Adams as compared to the aggregate of all prior mayors. So while Adams is clearly doing more designations in the outer boroughs than anywhere else, he's still doing it at a snail's pace compared to what his predecessors did. In the case of Upper Manhattan, it's almost so small that you can't see it there on the graph. And the difference is most dramatic in terms of the Manhattan core. As you can see, he is doing less than 1/100th, well less than 1/100th of the number of buildings designated per year in the Manhattan core as compared to his predecessors. But, the category where he does best, outer boroughs, he's only doing about just over a third of what his predecessors did. And this is broken out by number of landmark designations per year. So not buildings, which I would argue is really the most telling metric, but just number of actions taken by the commission. Here as well, very, very below par compared to all of his predecessors. This is a sort of close-up on that kind of shows you. You can see with the outer boroughs, it's down by about 40%. For Upper Manhattan, the teal, he's doing roughly, what is that, less than a quarter. And for the Manhattan core, it's, what would that come out to? Something like a tenth, just a bit more than a tenth of what his predecessors did in terms of number of landmark designations per year. Whoops. This also just breaks it out by historic districts. And as you can see, Mayor Adams has not designated any historic districts in either Upper Manhattan or the Manhattan core. If you look over here on the right-hand side, 0 for each of those over the course of his entire mayoralty. He has averaged 2 per year to, for the most part, very small districts in the outer boroughs. And in terms of the size of historic districts, so he is focusing exclusively on the outer boroughs, but those districts are much, much smaller than the ones that his predecessors dedicated there. And of course, it's 0 compared to 129 for Upper Manhattan and 0 compared to 172 buildings on average per historic district for the Manhattan core. We're going to kind of come back to this issue or question, but I want to highlight some of the other aspects that we looked at, which is changes in the landmarks law over the years and how it affected designations, and could some of these changes be explained by changes in landmarks law as opposed to changes in who is the mayor. So one of the first and most significant amendments to the landmarks law, as Dina mentioned, came at the end of 1973. And for the first time, it allowed the commission to designate interior landmarks and scenic landmarks. And as mentioned, interior landmarks are typically a room or a space on the inside of a building. Some examples that we have here that I'm showing are Radio City Music Hall at the bottom and Prospect Park at the top. So the commission began to almost immediately designate these landmarks, and there are now 123 and 12 of each respectively. However, they make up approximately 0.35% of all landmark sites and less than 8% of all landmark designations. So their introduction did not really appear to make a statistically significant change in the rate of landmark designations, nor did the amendment, the other thing that the amendment did was it allowed the commission more flexibility in terms of when and how to do designations. Now, this was interesting and perhaps surprising. In fact, the years immediately following the amendment's passage had some of the lowest levels of designation activity by the commission until recently, in spite of the fact that more kinds of landmark designations were possible and fewer restrictions existed upon how designations could be done as a result of this amendment to the law. However, those years following its passage coincided with the administration of Mayor Abe Beame, whose rate of landmark designations was the second lowest of all mayors. And following the end of Beame's administration, the rate of landmark designations picked up again under Mayor Koch, really pointing to the fact that it's the mayor who has a much bigger impact upon landmark designations than this change in the law, certainly in least terms of frequency or breadth of designations. And so here's that chart again. The red line, which has been inserted, kind of shows before and after this amendment to the landmarks law. As you can see, there was this counterintuitive huge drop off after that, but then it picked up again under Koch and particularly under Dinkins, showing that really the level of activity is, at the end of the day, much more about the mayor than certainly, at least in this case, about the law or this particular change in the law. Now we get to 2016 when there was a different change in the law, which instead of making it easier for landmark designations to take place or to cover a broader range of types of locations, it was more restrictive. And this was Intro 775A, which for the first time put in place restrictions on how long the Landmarks Preservation Commission could take to consider sites for designation. And it had a much more noticeable and predictable impact than the 1973 amendments to the landmarks law. So its provisions basically were that it allowed a maximum of 1 year for the consideration of individual landmark designations, as well as for scenic and interior landmarks. And it allowed a maximum of 2 years for historic district consideration of historic district designations. Now, at the time, preservation groups like Village Preservation, I'm pretty sure Friends of the Upper East Side, and a lot of other groups expressed quite a few concerns, including that it would discourage more difficult, controversial, or complicated designations. And we pointed out that many of our city's most important designations took considerably longer to designate than the new law allowed in terms of timeframes, including more than half of our city's landmark structures at the time of that the bill was being considered. And this included Grand Central Station, the Woolworth Building, Rockefeller Center, and historic districts like Greenwich Village, the Grand Concourse, Bed-Stuy, West Harlem, Jackson Heights, and Park Slope all took longer than the required time that the bill gave. So here, these graphs show basically the before and after with Intro 775. The solid colored bars show you designations prior to the passage of the law, the hollow colored ones after. So in terms of the average number of landmark designations per year, the drop is 60%. In terms of the average number of historic districts designated per year, the drop is a relatively modest 17%, but when you combine that with the all-important next piece, which is the average number of buildings in each historic district designated, which was down by 53%, you get to the final bar, which really is the most telling one, which is the average number of buildings designated per year dropped by 61% in the post-Intro 775A era as compared to the pre-Intro 775A era. And here's just a closer look again at some of those figures. So as you can see, while the number of districts designated, it's only a relatively modest drop. The size of these districts decreased very significantly, which really correlates with what we and others had been saying in terms of our fear or concern that it would discourage more complicated, controversial, difficult, time-consuming types of designations. So we decided to drill down, not just in this case, particularly by year, to look at what happened in the time both before and after the passage of Intro 775A, which was passed roughly in mid-year in 2016. So if you look here, based on these various data points, as you can see, there's a big difference between the years before and after Intro 775A. So even with the same mayor, there's many fewer designations, number of buildings, number of historic districts, number of actions or number of landmark designations taking place in the before and after years. And here it is just kind of aggregated. On the left, you have the de Blasio pre-Intro 775A years. In the middle are the de Blasio post-Intro 775A years. But that does include 2020 when the commission was not for months was not operating. So fair enough, that should be excluded. So the final set here is the post de Blasio post 775A years with 2020 taken out. And as you can see, it is still a it's a night and day comparison between the time period before and after. So one of the other factors that we wanted to look at was the equity framework, which is not a law, but which is a policy that the Landmarks Preservation Commission adopted in January of 2020, which, as the commission says, is intended to ensure diversity and inclusion in designations to make sure that we're telling the stories of all New Yorkers and to offer a set of priorities to ensure a more equitable representation of our city's diverse history through our designations and to ensure the geographic diversity of designations. So we decided to take a look and see, well, how well are they doing this now that they have the equity framework? Are we seeing more designations in the outer boroughs? Are we seeing more designations in Upper Manhattan? Now, of course, one could evaluate this by other means in terms of types of communities represented, types of histories represented, which is a very important way of looking at it. It's a little harder to quantify that in terms of data. So this report focused on the geographic aspects. And here's what we found. Post-equity framework, the number of landmark designations per year in the outer boroughs declined by 51%. In Upper Manhattan, it declined by 45%. And in the Manhattan core, it declined most dramatically by 85%, looking at number of landmark designations. If you look at the number of buildings, also a dramatic decline in the outer boroughs and a particularly dramatic decline in the Manhattan core. The one area where there's an increase is in Upper Manhattan, but there's a very important asterisk there, which says that the Upper Manhattan building designations almost entirely reflect the designation of a single district, the Dorrance Brooks Square district, which was designated in 2021 and was actually in motion before the equity framework was even adopted. And this sort of breakout kind of gives you a clearer sense of things as well. Basically, the kind of checkerboard is the number of historic district designations. The dots is the average number of buildings in a district, and then the solid bar is sort of the combination of the two, the sort of net effect of the two combined, which is the number of buildings designated in historic districts per year. So as you can see in the outer boroughs, a steep decline. In Upper Manhattan, there is this increase, but again, it's virtually exclusively reflects this one district, which happened at the very beginning of the passage of the equity framework and had been in motion prior to that. And in the Manhattan core, there has not been a single, not one, historic district designated in the time period since that was passed. Oops. Yeah, this also just sort of shows you that the size of historic districts pre and post adoption of the equity framework have shrunk overall. Again, the one caveat, Upper Manhattan, again, it reflects exclusively a single 275 building district in Harlem that took place at the very beginning. So the last thing that the report really looked at is it's very clear that under the current mayor and in the years preceding the current mayor, we've seen an extreme drop off in the number of landmark designations which have taken place. So we wanted to look at what was being landmarked, what was being designated now that we had fewer and more constricted choices being made in terms of designations. Now, the hope, and by the way, what's shown here, which is taken from the report, are some of the designations that the LPC has done over the years, where in most cases they were preventing a building, very important building, from being demolished or lost. And one would hope that if the commission was doing many, many fewer designations in recent years, that they'd be focusing ever more so on buildings that face immediate threats and really, really need landmark designation and need it as soon as possible. Unfortunately, that's not what we found when we did a closer analysis. This is what we did find, which is that in recent years, a significant percentage of sites the commission has chosen to designate have been either those that are already landmarked, typically individual landmark designations of sites that are already designated as parts of historic districts, which they started doing in 2015. So they're sort of landmarking again a building that was previously landmarked for a reason, but still it's an already protected building. Buildings that are city owned, and therefore the city already has the power to ensure their preservation without a landmark designation. And the flip side is, because it's a city-owned building, the city has abilities that a private owner does not have to be able to, say, sidestep, massage, blunt the regulatory decisions. City parks, which are city-owned and which, in addition to the above conditions, by virtue of state law, are already protected from loss or compromise. Cemeteries, which as a result of a variety of existing regulations, are already encumbered, and therefore difficult, if not impossible, to destroy or remove. Interior landmarks, which unfortunately now have a much more limited regulatory applicability than other types of designations due to recent court rulings and actions of the commission. Basically, if a property owner decides to make an interior landmark space no longer accessible to the public, the commission's ability to regulate it largely disappears. And then lastly, sites that by virtue of the density of their current development in relation to existing zoning regulations are unlikely to face any threat of demolition in any foreseeable time frame. So we're finding that a very large percentage of the designations that the commission is doing in recent years fall into one or multiple of these categories, meaning places that either arguably need the designation less because they already have some of these protections in place. Doesn't mean they don't merit it, doesn't mean they don't deserve it, but particularly if there's a very limited number of designations going on, one needs to take a very close look at what's being chosen to designate and what's being chosen not to designate, or ones where the designation is really of a sort of limited applicability or effect. So let's move ahead here. Whoops. So here, by the way, is a look at the sites that are already landmarked that the city landmarked again as individual landmarks. So these are buildings that were located in historic districts which they then named individual landmarks, which had never been done prior to 2015. Now, interestingly, to put together this presentation, I looked at them and was a little surprised to discover that unless I've missed one, and maybe I have, every single one of them was a site that was given this extra designation because of its connection to LGBTQ history. So we have Stonewall, the LGBT going across the top, the LGBT Community Center, the Gay Activist Alliance Firehouse, the James Baldwin House, Cafe Chino, going across the bottom right to left now, the Audre Lorde House on Staten Island, the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Brooklyn, and Julius's Bar. It's an interesting phenomenon, particularly given that there are sites that Village Preservation and other advocates out there are pushing for that are LGBTQ history sites that we are trying to get landmarked that don't already have landmark designation that the city and the LPC has thus far refused to designate. So it almost seems as though if you want to get your LGBTQ site landmarked, it better be landmarked already in order for it to have a shot. Hopefully that's not the case, but this is a rather striking phenomenon that we are seeing here. So, you know, we went through over the last couple of years to sort of try to quantify these various categories that I discussed and see how they ranked in terms of the designations. So as you can see, of the 8 landmark designations that the Commission did in 2024, 62.5% of them fell into one of these categories. In 2023, it was 36%. In 2022, it was 83%, which is stunning. In 2021, 62%. In 2020, which was obviously a very odd year, the Commission didn't even operate at full level. It was 25%. And in 2019, it was roughly half of them that fell into one of these categories. So the Commission, we're finding in recent years, is not only choosing to do many fewer designations, but choosing to designate buildings that are already in some way protected, already in some way encumbered, or where the designation would have much more limited effect. And here again from the report are just some examples of buildings that the Commission either, all of them are buildings that the Commission has at least thus far refused to designate or didn't designate, some of which are lost, some of which are still there. Right in the middle is the Hotel Pennsylvania, which has been demolished. This is the Harlem Women's Hospital, also demolished, where Martin Luther King was brought after an assassination attempt, which also had an incredibly important history in relation to African-American nurses. Many of you know about the Dangler Mansion up here in Brooklyn, which the Commission, to give them credit, tried to designate but didn't move quickly enough, and it was demolished anyway. And Parkchester in the Bronx, which people have been trying to get designated for years, which is losing this beautiful Art Deco sculpture on it. This is the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary in the East Village, which has an incredibly important history connected to people with disabilities. There are no landmarks in New York that really specifically honor disability history. The Commission has thus far refused to designate. So these are just a couple of examples. And here from the addendum from the report are a whole range of sites that the Commission has chosen not to landmark in the last couple of years. 857 Riverside Drive, which is an underground railroad house, imminently threatened. You can see here a picture of the Renaissance Ballroom and Casino in Harlem, which really had a tremendous history connected to the Harlem Renaissance, demolished. Also pictured here, the 5 Points Art Center in Long Island City, beloved New York City landmark, I'm sure many of you know. Not pictured, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church on West 14th Street, which we are pushing to get landmarked, which was the New York's very first Spanish language church. An important piece of our history that is not adequately represented or recognized. The proposed Lower East Side tenement historic district reflecting immigrant and working class history. The Walt Whitman House in Brooklyn, referencing that LGBTQ history that the commission has not acted upon. And similarly below it, 85th Avenue, which we've been pushing for designation, which was the headquarters of the country's first national LGBTQ rights organization. And here are just some other examples: the African burial ground in Elmhurst, Queens, the former New York City Women's Suffrage League headquarters on 14th Street that we've been trying to get designated, an important aspect of women's suffrage history that really deserves more recognition. Oh, actually, let me just go back. I skipped over this. The Lenox Terrace Apartments in Harlem, a really important part of the history, not only of Harlem, but of New York City in terms of African-American success, leadership. The Union Carbide building, which aside from being this incredibly wasteful example of an enormous building, the largest building ever purposely demolished in the history of the world, but also by one of the 20th century's great female architects who was key to the design of that building. Unfortunately, not enough to get the commission to act. Bruckner Boulevard Historic District in the Bronx. So, we're seeing this all over the place. And then very last, I'm going to end here. When we issued this report at the beginning of September, 50 West 13th Street, which was pictured here, had not yet been landmarked. It has been, but it took 4 very long years to get the commission to do it. And because it took so long, in spite of the fact that it has this incredible history connected to abolitionism, civil rights, 19th century African-American life, the women's suffrage movement, as well as 20th century theater and LGBTQ history. This very, very important piece of the building, this beautiful and unique ironwork doorway surround, among other aspects of the building, were stripped before the designation took place. So they're gone and gone forever. So I'm looking forward to our discussion and hearing some questions. Basically, the takeaway from the report is we are in a really, really challenging place in relation to landmark designations right now under the current administration. It's important that we be aware of how that picture looks so that we know what we're dealing with, and we can think about solutions and the changes that we want to see happen. And hopefully this discussion, this report, this program can be part of that. So I'm going to turn it over to William and our friends from NYPAP and friends.
All righty. So would you like me to go forward with asking questions that have been submitted by the audience then?
Well, I think we just want to have NYPAP and friends. I think each of you guys wanted to maybe raise a few things or say something before we opened it up to the general public.
Yeah, let's do that. Andrew and Dina, thank you so much for this insightful presentation and very comprehensive report. And I think this pretty much reflects and aligns with our experience in the Upper East Side. I have 2 questions and comments. One pertains to the report indicating a shift in LPC's focus toward designating sites that face no immediate threat. One example, Andrew, is the Church of St. Elizabeth of Hungary. So recently, this summer, we applied for we sent an RFE, request for evaluation to LPC for a landmark designation, and it was denied because of modest scale, a narrow mid-block site, and common architectural style, which is Gothic revival, I think. So it seems to me this is quite counterintuitive in terms of protecting the legacy, architectural and cultural legacy of New York. So why do you think this is happening right now, that the shift towards other sites, already protected sites perhaps? And my second question is about the 775A, which impose limits on LPC's consideration of landmark designations. And I was wondering what do you think, and Dina, because you are a former LPC employee as well, how do you think technology and digital tools can sort of expedite the process of research or landmarking that might perhaps help with this problem of shortening the time that LPC can spend on it? If you could just expand on those 2 points, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Sure. Wow, those are really thought-provoking questions. So I'll chime in first, and then Dina. So on the first question, look, let me say this. I think on any individual potential designation, there can be arguments of why it should have been designated, why it shouldn't have been designated, et cetera. Clearly, this shows 30,000 feet, a big pattern, and the pattern is less, less, less. And in terms of the why, my sense is that it's a combination of the real estate industry's incredibly powerful influence. They've always been largely, if not exclusively, opposed to landmark designation and to anything that sort of ties their hands. Certainly in recent years, there's been this conflation in terms of thinking that somehow anything that prevents unbridled development is also part of what's responsible for making our city more expensive and more inequitable and things like that. So therefore, we have to limit landmark designations. We have to limit contextual zoning. We have to limit zoning protections as much as possible. We've got to do everything we can to get out of the way of build, build, build. And that philosophy clearly has taken root at City Hall. So I think part of it is just that we're swimming upstream against a really, really powerful tide. Unless the commission feels tremendous, tremendous, tremendous pressure, more so than ever in the past, they're not going to do it. And they're particularly not going to do it in any part of the city where City Hall feels this is where we want to see building happen. Mm-hmm. So that's my sort of general sense of it. And Dina, why don't I'm going to toss the second question over to you, although feel free to respond to the first one as well if you wish.
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking about the second question, which is really interesting. I haven't thought of it quite in those terms of technology before, but in my own personal experience, I joined the LPC in 2018. So that's after 775A was in effect. So Andrew and maybe others have more experience with kind of seeing the shift take place. But I did want to mention that a silver lining for us during COVID was that we were forced to utilize technology. That city government, you may not be surprised to hear, we were not very up on technology until we were forced to be. And so in that regard, a lot of kind of the surveys and the digital tools that preservationists have access to, LPC was forced to contend with and kind of get on board with. So I think in that regard, there's potential for expediting things because they now have access to tools that they weren't using before. I don't know how that has or will play out in terms of the reality of whether things move more quickly because of that or not. I don't know enough to say, but I do think that it's a really interesting question and thing to acknowledge that we do have tools potentially at our disposal that we didn't years ago. And the one other thing I'll say related to 775A is that I think in terms of the time limit, in many cases, LPC theoretically certainly could designate things within those quicker timeframes if they're motivated to. It's not that it's not possible for them to do it that quickly by any means. 1 year is enough for a building, 2 years is enough for a historic district. But I think pointing to some of the things that Andrew has already mentioned, for example, the size of historic districts, when you want to designate a much larger area or a large building even that has multiple stakeholders, it can sometimes take longer to finesse all of the details that you need to do something like that. And so, possibly that's why we're seeing some shifts in how those things are happening.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, I think it's 100% about political will. As Dina said, it's doable, it's challenging. There's got to be a desire there to do it.
Thank you.
I can jump in now. I think we at the New York Preservation Archive project really want to commend every preservation producing value that is going to be looked at by students and preservationists for many, many years to come. We've added it to our own preservation resource library. I think what's also really important is that you mentioned this will be a living document that is updated, which means that this will be more than just something that people can look back at the state of preservation in 2024, 25, 50 years from now. It's also something that people will be able to look at, on a more frequent basis and see, is change actually happening? So I think the answer to your question may depend on what political environment we end up with on the mayoral level in the future. But do you have a 1-year short-term goal for this report, or even a 5-year goal about its impact and what you hope it can change?
That's a great question, Emily. And before I answer it, let me just say that that is high praise indeed, coming from NIPAP, which is such an esteemed organization and does such incredible work to really document the preservation movement. So thank you for that. The updating the report, we want it to continue to be a resource. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that Village Preservation years ago pioneered taking applications for changes to landmark buildings and put them online and made them available to the public when that was not being done, so that it was so much more accessible for people to do. I mean, now we sort of can't imagine not having that, but it was a sort of radical step forward. And I'm hoping that having this sort of running list of what has been designated can also help inform the way people look at, what's happening with landmark designation. And I want to give the LPC credit. They've done some great things in the last couple of years in terms of technology and tools. I love that interactive map that Dina showed, and they've done a lot of other great things. One thing they haven't done, though, is this, and I think it's needed. And bringing it back to your question, more than anything, the goal is to raise awareness, for people to recognize that it hasn't always been this way. It doesn't have to be this way, and that it really is about who the mayor is. And by the way, the current mayor could change his approach tomorrow if he wanted to. He's not locked into it. I don't know how likely that is. But it's very clear that who we elect to Gracie Mansion is ultimately going to be the person that decides how this policy is set, what the LPC does, how vigorous it is, how far-reaching it is, what it chooses to protect, what it chooses to ignore, and that it's really incumbent upon all of us to try to ensure that the person who is making those decisions is somebody who shares the values that we have and the priorities that we all have. Nuha, was there anything did you want to ask something or say something?
Yeah, so I just had a comment. Well, first of all, I mean, I wanted to echo what Emily said, because, this report is really invaluable. It's, it's a historic document in terms of its overview and its historic sort of, viewpoints, and then also in terms of its data and analysis. And it gives us, I think it's equally important as a tool to help us kind of navigate this sort of currently quite bleak regulatory landscape, and to think about, ways in which we might sort of mobilize and focus our advocacy as preservation advocates. And, as Zainab was saying, this is something that we're thinking about because we've been focusing our efforts on the Upper East Side, on Yorkville, and it might seem sort of petty and peevish to in a place like the Upper East Side, where we have, 7 historic districts and we have 131 individual landmarks, and you might think that we're sort of overrepresented in that way. We still have Yorkville, which is a huge area, and it's not regulated, and it's under enormous sort of development pressures. And so, how do we move forward? We submit these RFEs to the LPC, and we haven't really had much luck in the last few years. And, as your data pointed out, it was actually, we saw our last sort of individual landmarks and historic districts designated under Bloomberg, and maybe the last one under de Blasio's sort of, very early days or something. But, not since then. And so I think your report is really useful because it kind of shows us what we need to do going forward. It shows us sort of, okay, fine, it's like the pivotal role of the mayor and in shaping the direction that that landmark designations take. And also, that we really need to sort of step up and work with the LPC in creative ways, and and really sort of form a coalition to push, so that so we can push for greater resources for the LPC, and how that might in fact help us. And in fact, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the sort of pathways forward from this report and from your analysis. So that was my very sort of general comment.
Sure. No, and it's a great one. And by the way, it's such a pleasure and an honor to get to work with a group like Friends. You guys do such amazing work. And there's so many things that you've done that have inspired and helped us. So, I love the fact that we get to do these kinds of things together. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's an easy answer. I wish there was. And in some ways, part of the reason for doing the report was to say, this is the challenge. This is the question. We got to dig into it and figure out, sort of what to do from here. And I will say this, I mean, part of what makes it difficult is that ultimately, I think it comes down to things that to a certain degree extend beyond the purview of 501c3s like ours. None of us can endorse candidates. None of us can tell people who to vote for. But it is, in fact, the people who win those elections who make these decisions that are incredibly important to the issues that we care about. But what I think we can try to do, and ways in which we can affect change here, is to make it clear to people why these things are so important, what it is that we're losing when we don't have the type of actions being taken that we think should be, and to really show that this false dichotomy that's been projected about things like landmark designation and contextual zoning somehow running contrary to efforts to create a more affordable city, a more equitable city, is exactly that, a false dichotomy, a 100% false dichotomy. And in fact, we just issued a different report that shows that what we actually have seen happen in the city over the last 10 years is that neighborhoods that have the policies that these folks are pushing, which is the more building, actually tend to become less Black, less Hispanic, whereas neighborhoods that have the more neighborhood-friendly restrictive zoning or landmark designations over that same time period actually tended to become more Black and more Hispanic. So, in fact, this work is, well, it's not the cure-all by any means for all of the challenges or problems that are facing our city. It is completely false to say that it is in any way an impediment to making our city more equitable and more affordable. And I would argue it can be one of many tools in the tool shed to help get us to a better city for everybody. And I think that that's critical for us to project that message. So, William, why don't we hit some public questions?
We have a lot of great questions from the audience. So let's start with one of the more fun ones, and I want to hear the answer to this one. Dina, you mentioned that there are 2 landmarked trees in New York. Where are they? And do the owners have to file requests with LPC to trim the branches?
Yes, I can quickly speak to this. So, okay, very sadly, one of the two trees is no longer with us because the tree died, I think it was in 1998, not through any fault of the owner or the LPC process or anything like that. It was just naturally. I'm not sure of the details. It might have had some kind of disease or something. But at any rate, I believe there's still a plaque or some sort of thing indicating that it was a landmarked tree location, and that was out in Flushing, Queens. The other tree, the one that I showed a photo of in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, is still standing, and I'm pretty sure that they can trim the tree without an LPC permit because LPC doesn't really regulate that sort of thing. But it's really if the owners would want to relocate the tree or remove it or do anything that actually impacts the integrity of it. But it's such a special, now that it's the only one, it's such a unique case that I think LPC staff would have to think about it carefully because there's no real precedent other than itself.
Now, this is one kind of for everybody on the panel, and there's been so much written and talked about the housing crisis in all of our major cities. And someone asked, I would love to hear the panel's view about how the desire to construct more housing and the desire to protect landmarks, both laudable goals, might coexist and potentially even benefit each other.
Well, I'll jump in because it's definitely an issue I've focused on a lot. You know, as I mentioned before, I not only do I think that there's no contradiction between the two, I think the things like landmark designation and contextual zoning that help keep buildings intact, buildings which often have existing affordable housing in them, can be a part of a much broader menu of tools to help make our city affordable. I'm very proud that at Village Preservation, we've fought for some of the city's only landmark designations for affordable housing complexes, which we did in conjunction with the residents of those affordable housing complexes. And actually just today, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the landmark designation of First Houses. That designation preceded our organization existing, but that was the very first public affordable housing development in the country, which is in the East Village, which is a wonderful, wonderful complex of buildings on Avenue A and 3rd Street. And we've worked with residents there to use the landmark status of the building to help them get things like repairs and things like that. So there's a lot of ways in which these two goals can be brought together and can be mutually helpful.
Anyone else want to chime in? All right, then we will move on to our next question. So someone asked, we have seen painfully in recent years that landmarking has no teeth when it comes to protecting buildings from danger. What can be done about that? And I'm assuming they're asking about landmark buildings being handed over to developers and being damaged and then eventually having to be torn down. So how can we better protect our landmarked buildings?
I know Dina works on this a lot. You know, it's true, all too often buildings that are landmarked, we see people either just violating the law or in some cases the LPC allowing things that we would say they should never be allowed. We could have a whole program on this topic. Here's what I'll say now, and feel free to follow up with me directly to have a sort of a broader conversation about this. The landmarking process is imperfect, and we see a lot of things happening with it that we don't love. That said, it's the best regulatory mechanism that we have in terms of preserving and protecting buildings. So we shouldn't give up on it. We should try to make it work the way that it should work. And it is work. I always tell everybody, don't think once you've gotten the building landmarked, it's all roses from here, your job is done. That's just the beginning of the next chapter, which is to make sure that the commission does its job, and that the building is preserved as it is. So we do need to do more there, but there's no other regulatory mechanism like it that has the potential to help preserve a building the way that it should be. And I don't know if Dina or folks from Friends or Emily want to add anything to that.
Sure. I can add that at least, as far as Village Preservation's work is concerned, and I'm sure there are similar things happening on the Upper East Side and elsewhere with our neighborhood preservation colleagues. We receive many notifications all the time from members of the public in the neighborhood who are concerned about potentially illegal work going on in landmark buildings or within historic districts. And so we have a pretty close relationship with the violations department at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And, as Andrew insinuated, it's not perfect. Things fall through the cracks or different things happen. But in many, many cases, we are able to work with LPC to rectify issues before they get too dire, or to identify when something might be in violation, or work is happening that wasn't even permitted by LPC. That happens all the time too. So I think as neighborhood preservation organizations, in that way, we're hopefully an asset to LPC in that we help keep an eye on things and identify when issues might be happening where LPC can't be everywhere all at once. And so we all have to work together to identify issues and help make sure that they're not happening.
And by the way, I'm just dropping in the chat now to everybody. If you're looking at this information and saying, I want to change things, I want city officials to know that I don't think it's good that we're doing so few landmark designations and that we're ignoring buildings that need to be landmarked, go to the link that I'm sending you in the chat, and it's a place where you can, with just a couple of clicks, send letters to the mayor, every city council member, borough presidents, basically saying that, and pointing to the statistics in this report, so that you can let them know that you want them to listen and that you want to see them make a change.
Righty. Then someone asks, after the mayor has named the chair of the commission, how does the mayor actually influence LPC's decision-making process?
That's a very interesting question. In theory, the mayor could appoint someone to the commission and they could then do whatever they want, if that was what they wanted to do. Now, if they did that and displeased the mayor, they'd probably never get a job in government again, and the mayor could replace them. So basically, there's kind of an understanding when you are appointed to the commission that you are expected to work closely with City Hall on what you do. I'm guessing that in some very specific cases that City Hall actually tells you specifically what they want done on certain cases, and in other cases kind of gives you some parameters to operate within. But historically, the commission used to be much more independent. But over the years, the mayors have come to exert much more control over the chairs of the commission. So they kind of know that by accepting the job, and if they want to keep the job, and if they want similar jobs in the future, they've got to be a team player. And, that's not unique to the Landmarks Preservation Commission by any means. But when you think about it, an agency that controls real estate in New York City, obviously there's a lot of pressure to make sure that you're not going rogue in terms of how you do things.
All right. Well, something kind of to ask to the whole panel is Friends and Village Preservation are very neighborhood-based organizations. So I would love to hear, what are some of the unique circumstances for working specifically in the neighborhood, but how can preservation organizations, even if they are neighborhood based, can support each other beyond doing fabulous programs with each other? And then Emily, running that archive of looking at preservation, what is some of the great ways that you've seen different preservation organizations cooperate with each other to really support each other's mission? How about friends? Friends, you could chime in. What are some of the circumstances that you feel are unique to your neighborhood, but also then can, help inspire us at Village Preservation?
Well, I mean, Friends is a tiny organization. You're basically looking at us both here, but or most of us anyway. And so we rely, on our colleagues across the city in many different ways. And so, Andrew, we work together with Andrew and Dina quite closely and share information, and we have especially with all these sort of citywide zoning regulation changes these days, we've had to really sort of come together because a lot of the issues are issues that we're all facing. And so, it's absolutely imperative, and we have a close group of colleagues and we all work together. But of course, each of our neighborhoods is unique and presents its own set of challenges. Like, as I was saying, on the east side, we have really great protections and really great historic districts, but then we have like vast areas that are not regulated, such as Yorkville, as I was saying. And so, that presents a unique challenge because people perceive the Upper East Side as well protected and, with massive sort of resources and things like that, but it's not the whole story. And so how do we present to the public and in our advocacy? And so, there are unique challenges, but we're very lucky to be able to work together, at least from our point of view.
Yeah, I want to know, we are based on the Upper East Side as well. However, we are not a neighborhood-based nonprofit. We cover preservation history in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And I think that these co-sponsored events, conversations like this, are really what's important to both documenting preservation in the past and pushing forward change in the future. So something I've been wanting to bring up is that, we work with a lot of other organizations, peer institutions like Friends, like Village Preservation, to talk about documenting institutional history, to talk about documenting the stories of loss. Just thinking about, Andrew and Dina brought up a lot of stories of buildings that unfortunately were not landmarked. But that does not mean that these fights are a loss. We can preserve the story of what happened to them to try to prevent it from happening to another building, another community in the future. And just having these conversations as a preservation community is what's so important. So I know Village Preservation and the Archive Project have worked on oral histories together for decades. And it's these types of partnerships that's helped us to really document preservation history on a broader range, as opposed to just in one neighborhood or even just in Manhattan.
Great. William, I saw a question in the chat that I thought was particularly, or in the Q&A that I thought was particularly interesting, which was anyone from the LPC asked to be part of this conversation? The simple answer is no, which does not mean that we actually meet with and talk with the LPC all the time, and we actually have done public programming with them over the years. But really, this is it's a critique the LPC. So it's really appropriate for it to be kind of outside groups, taking a look at what the commission is doing or not doing, and saying, this is what we see and this is what we think about it. There's definitely a lot of places for working with the LPC, and we do that. But that's not really the way tonight's event is focused. That said, if the commission says they want to have a meeting with us to talk about their level of designations and what they're planning for the future, I'm game.
Alrighty, so it is now 7:35. So thank you, all of you, Nuha, Zainab, Emily, Andrew, Dina, for your wonderful input, your great presentations. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. Really appreciate it. I am sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. I'm sure we could actually be here discussing this all night, but we all want to go to bed eventually. This program has been recorded, so it will be posted on Village Preservation's YouTube channel in a couple of days. All the links that have been shared in the chat will be included in the follow-up email that you will be sent. But again, a big thank you to our panel this evening. Thank you to you, our audience, for joining us. And please go visit all the great organization websites. Again, those links will be shared with everyone. But thank you to our friends at Upper East Side and at New York Preservation Archive Project. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you, William.